I thought 10 years meant something until I came home from Phoenix to find my girlfriend loading boxes into a rental truck like she was fleeing a crime scene. The sight of Brooke frantically hauling our shared belongings down the front steps of our Denver townhouse hit me like a physical blow, made worse by the careful precision with which she'd clearly planned this moment while I was away on what I'd assumed was just another routine consulting project for my accounting firm. I stood there in the driveway with my travel bag, watching her load what looked like half our furniture into a U-Haul, and realized she'd been orchestrating this betrayal for months while I'd been sending her good morning texts from my hotel room and buying her favorite coffee beans at the Phoenix airport. The woman I'd been planning to propose to next month was systematically dismantling our entire life together with the efficient ruthlessness of someone closing a business deal, and she didn't even pause when she saw me standing there in complete shock. When I finally found my voice and asked what was happening, she straightened up and delivered the news with the cold professionalism she usually reserved for difficult clients at her marketing firm, explaining that she'd been offered an amazing opportunity in Seattle and had already accepted a position with a prestigious agency there. The words came out in a rehearsed rush, like she'd practiced this conversation in the mirror, but what made my stomach drop wasn't the job announcement itself. It was the casual mention of Damien, a tech startup founder she'd met at a corporate retreat 6 months ago, who apparently had connections at the Seattle firm and would be helping her transition to the Pacific Northwest. I remembered that retreat now with sickening clarity, how excited she'd been about the networking opportunities and how she'd come back talking about innovative marketing strategies and disruptive business models, using buzzwords I'd never heard her use before and displaying an enthusiasm for her career that had seemed refreshing at the time but now felt like the beginning of the end. She continued packing while she talked, explaining how she'd been interviewing with Seattle firms for the past 3 months and had already secured an apartment with Damien, who'd convinced her that Denver's marketing scene was too limited for someone with her potential and ambition. The revelation that she'd been secretly planning this massive life change while maintaining our normal routine of weekend farmers markets and quiet dinners hit me harder than her actual departure, because it meant she'd been living a double life for months while I'd been completely oblivious to her growing dissatisfaction with everything we'd built together. When I asked her why she couldn't have just talked to me about wanting to advance her career, she finally stopped loading boxes and looked at me with something between pity and impatience, explaining that she felt like she'd lost an entire decade to our relationship and needed to experience real success before it was too late. The way she said it made it clear that our 10 years together weren't a foundation we'd built, but time she'd wasted, and that everything I'd thought we were working toward had been nothing more than a comfortable prison that prevented her from achieving her true potential. She listed specific moments of dissatisfaction with surgical precision, mentioning how embarrassing it was when her colleagues talked about their partner's innovative projects while she had to describe my predictable accounting work and stable but unexciting lifestyle, and how frustrated she'd become with my preference for quiet evenings over networking events where she could have been building the connections that led to this Seattle opportunity. The confrontation intensified when she brought up my reluctance to invest in cryptocurrency ventures like Damien does, pointing out that while I'd been content with traditional investment strategies and conservative financial planning, he'd been building wealth through Bitcoin and startup equity that could set them up for early retirement. She spoke about Damien with a reverence I'd never heard her use when talking about me, describing his vision for the future and his willingness to take calculated risks that could pay off exponentially, while I'd been focused on steady growth and building security through boring but reliable methods. The way she contrasted our approaches to money and career advancement made it clear that she saw my cautious nature as a fundamental character flaw rather than the responsible foundation I'd always believed it to be, and that my preference for stability over speculation had become a source of deep resentment. She explained that Damien understood her ambitions in ways I never had, encouraging her to think bigger and take chances that could lead to extraordinary success rather than the modest middle-class life we'd been building together through careful planning and gradual progress. The criticism felt like a character assassination delivered by someone who'd been taking notes on my shortcomings for years, waiting for the right moment to present her case for why I was holding her back from the life she deserved. As she continued loading boxes with mechanical efficiency, I realized that every quiet evening I'd treasured as quality time together had been seen by her as wasted opportunities, and every financial decision I'd made with our future in mind had been viewed as evidence of my limited thinking. The real devastation came when Brooke unleashed what felt like years of stored resentment, systematically dismantling every aspect of my character with the precision of someone who'd been building a case against me for months while I remained completely unaware of her growing contempt. She explained with clinical detachment how my small-town mentality had become increasingly embarrassing to her as she advanced in her career, contrasting my steady but unremarkable accounting work with Damien's innovative tech ventures that were disrupting traditional business models and attracting serious venture capital investment. The way she described our weekend routine of farmers markets and board game nights made it sound like torture she'd endured rather than quality time I'd believed we were sharing, and she pointed out how humiliating it was when her colleagues discussed their partners' groundbreaking projects while she had to mention my latest tax preparation work. She detailed specific conversations where she'd felt diminished by association with my predictable lifestyle, explaining how Damien's friends were launching startups and investing in emerging technologies, while our social circle consisted of other accountants who talked about mortgage rates instead of revolutionary business opportunities. The comparison felt deliberately cruel, designed to make me understand that I wasn't just losing her to another man, but to an entirely different vision of what success and ambition should look like in someone worthy of her affection and respect. When I desperately suggested that we could work on our relationship or even move to Seattle together if her career was that important to her future happiness, she actually laughed with genuine amusement, explaining that the problem wasn't geographic but fundamental incompatibility between her evolving vision of success and my contentment with mediocrity. She told me that some people simply outgrow each other, and that while I'd remained static in my approach to life and career advancement, she'd been expanding her horizons and developing relationships with people who challenged her to think bigger and take risks that could lead to extraordinary outcomes. The way she said it made it clear that she viewed our decade together as her personal dark age, a period of settling for less than she deserved while she figured out what she actually wanted from life and found the courage to pursue it with someone who matched her ambition. She explained that Damien represented everything she needed in a partner: entrepreneurial vision, financial sophistication, and most importantly, the kind of lifestyle that would open doors rather than limit her potential for advancement. As she spoke, I realized that every moment of contentment I'd felt in our relationship had been built on a complete misunderstanding of what she wanted, and that my greatest strengths as a partner had actually been the qualities she found most suffocating. The chapter reached its devastating climax when Damien arrived in his gleaming Tesla to help load the final boxes, and I found myself standing helplessly in what had been our shared living room, watching him effortlessly take charge while Brooke directed him with an efficiency that suggested they'd rehearsed this moment as carefully as everything else. The contrast between us was impossible to ignore. His expensive casual clothing and confident demeanor versus my wrinkled work shirt and obvious emotional distress. His immediate understanding of her organizational system versus my shocked paralysis. His comfortable ownership of the situation versus my desperate attempts to process the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about our relationship and future together. Watching them work as a coordinated team to dismantle the home we'd built together felt like witnessing my own funeral, as they efficiently packed away our shared memories, reducing 10 years of accumulated experiences to cardboard boxes marked for storage or donation. Damien moved through our space with casual authority, and I realized that even this final humiliation had been choreographed in advance, down to which items Brooke had decided were worth taking to her new life and which represented baggage she was eager to leave behind. The most crushing moment came when I noticed her carefully wrapping the vintage wine glasses we'd bought together on our anniversary trip to Napa Valley, items she was now packing with the detached efficiency of someone clearing out an estate sale. When I mentioned that those glasses held sentimental value, she explained that sentiment was exactly the backward-looking attachment that had kept her trapped, and that Damien had taught her to value experiences over nostalgic objects that anchored her to an outgrown version of herself. The final blow came when she handed me a typed list of shared expenses that needed to be divided, demonstrating a level of advanced planning that made it clear she'd been treating our relationship like a business partnership she was dissolving rather than a love story that was ending. As Damien loaded the last boxes and closed the tailgate with a satisfying electronic whir, Brooke turned to me one final time with what she thought was compassionate honesty, explaining that she hoped I'd eventually understand that she was doing us both a favor by refusing to settle for a relationship that had stopped challenging either of us to grow. She expressed hope that I'd find someone who appreciated my stability and predictable nature, making it sound like a consolation prize rather than the foundation for genuine happiness I'd always believed it could be. The morning after Brooke's departure, I woke up in what felt like a crime scene, surrounded by the ghostly outlines where furniture had once stood and the lingering scent of her vanilla perfume that somehow made the emptiness feel even more complete and devastating. I methodically began the process of erasing all traces of our shared life with the same systematic approach I used for complex financial audits, starting by terminating our lease early and accepting the penalty fees as a necessary cost of moving forward rather than remaining trapped in a space that had become a monument to my own naivety. The landlord was surprisingly understanding when I explained that my long-term tenant relationship had ended unexpectedly, and I managed to negotiate a reduced early termination fee by agreeing to handle all the cleaning and minor repairs myself, viewing the physical labor as therapeutic processing while taking concrete action toward rebuilding my independence. I spent the next week systematically selling our shared furniture through online marketplaces, carefully photographing each piece and writing detailed descriptions that focused on quality and condition rather than the memories attached to items like the dining room table where we'd planned our future or the couch where we'd spent countless evenings watching movies I now realized she'd probably found boring. The buyers were mostly young couples just starting out, and I found strange comfort in knowing that our carefully chosen belongings would become the foundation for relationships that might actually have staying power, unlike the decade-long illusion I'd been living under while completely misreading Brooke's true feelings about our life together. During this process, I blocked Brooke on every social media platform I could think of and changed my phone number, but not before she attempted to contact me through our mutual friends about items she claimed to have forgotten, which I recognized as obvious attempts to maintain some kind of connection or control over the situation rather than genuine concern about missing possessions. When her friend Jessica called to ask if Brooke could retrieve a box of old photos she'd supposedly left behind, I politely explained that I'd already donated all remaining items to charity and suggested she contact Goodwill if these mystery photos were truly important to her new Seattle lifestyle adventure. The most liberating moment came when my brother Carlos, who'd been watching this systematic dismantling with growing concern, invited me to stay at his place in nearby Boulder while I figured out my next steps, offering not just a temporary roof over my head but genuine emotional support from someone who'd never particularly liked Brooke and wasn't shy about expressing relief at her departure. Carlos had always been more perceptive about people than I was, and during our late-night conversations over beer in his kitchen, he helped me recognize patterns of manipulation and control in my relationship that I'd been too close to see clearly while they were happening in real time. When my firm offered me an opportunity to lead their new branch office in Charleston, South Carolina, I accepted immediately without even negotiating salary or researching the city, viewing the cross-country relocation as essential for my emotional healing and complete break from any possibility of accidentally encountering Brooke or Damien during their periodic visits to Denver for family or business purposes. The transfer came with a significant promotion to senior financial analyst and the chance to build a completely new professional network in a region where I had no history or baggage, representing not just career advancement but a geographic fresh start that would make it impossible for Brooke to casually drift back into my life when her Seattle adventure inevitably became more complicated than she'd anticipated during her initial excitement about escaping our supposedly limiting relationship. Charleston felt like the perfect choice for reinventing myself, far enough from Denver to represent a clean break, but still within the United States where my professional credentials would transfer easily and I could focus on building a new life rather than navigating international bureaucracy while emotionally vulnerable. The decision to relocate felt like taking control of my narrative for the first time in years, choosing to write my own next chapter rather than waiting around to see if Brooke would eventually realize she'd made a mistake and attempt to return to the stability she'd rejected with such cold certainty. I spent my final week in Colorado visiting places that had been important to me before Brooke entered my life, rediscovering parts of my identity that had been subsumed into our couple routine, and saying goodbye to the version of myself who'd been willing to accept someone's conditional love as better than no love at all. The drive across the country to Charleston became a form of moving meditation, giving me hundreds of miles and dozens of hours to process what had happened and gradually accept that Brooke's departure had actually freed me from a relationship where I'd been slowly diminishing myself to accommodate someone who fundamentally didn't respect the person I actually was. In Charleston, I threw myself into establishing the new branch office with an energy and focus I hadn't felt in years, discovering that without the constant undercurrent of relationship tension and criticism, I was actually far more competent and creative in my professional life than I'd realized during those final months with Brooke when her dissatisfaction had infected every aspect of my confidence. The historic charm of the city provided a perfect backdrop for reinvention, and I found myself exploring activities I'd never pursued during my relationship, starting with sailing lessons at the Charleston Harbor Marina, where the combination of technical skill and peaceful water meditation helped me process my emotions while building genuine new friendships with other sailing enthusiasts who appreciated my methodical approach to learning. I joined a local astronomy club that met twice monthly for stargazing sessions in nearby state parks, rediscovering my childhood fascination with celestial mechanics and finding unexpected satisfaction in the precise calculations required for tracking planetary movements, activities that reminded me of who I'd been before I started constantly second-guessing myself through Brooke's critical lens. The contrast between my new life and the cramped existence I'd been living in Denver became stark within just a few months, as I realized how much of myself I'd been suppressing to avoid triggering Brooke's complaints about my boring hobbies and predictable interests that apparently didn't align with her vision of a sophisticated partner worthy of her ambitions. It was during this period of personal renaissance that Brooke began reaching out through various indirect methods, initially through casual comments relayed by mutual friends who would mention in passing that she'd been asking about my well-being and new job situation, which I recognized as fishing expeditions designed to gather intelligence about my emotional state and potential availability. The breakthrough came when our mutual friend David called with barely concealed excitement to share news that he'd heard through the Denver social network, explaining that Damien's tech startup had failed spectacularly when their primary investors pulled funding after discovering questionable financial practices and inflated user metrics. According to David's detailed account, which he'd gleaned from multiple sources including former employees, the collapse had been swift and devastating, leaving Brooke stranded in Seattle with mounting credit card debt from the expensive lifestyle she'd been maintaining under the assumption that Damien's connections would provide long-term financial security. I learned that Brooke had been forced to move from their upscale apartment into a cramped studio in a questionable neighborhood after the marketing firm rescinded their job offer due to company downsizing that occurred just weeks after Damien's startup imploded, leaving her scrambling to find employment in a competitive market where her Denver experience didn't carry the weight she'd expected. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I'd been building genuine professional success and personal satisfaction in Charleston, Brooke was discovering that her calculated gamble on excitement over stability had backfired in exactly the way any reasonable person could have predicted, though I found myself surprisingly detached from her misfortune rather than feeling the vindication Carlos had suggested I should experience. Despite my brother's enthusiastic suggestions that I should feel vindicated by Brooke's spectacular failure to find the success and sophistication she'd abandoned our relationship to pursue, I realized that my emotional investment in our decade together had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine indifference that felt far healthier than either anger or satisfaction would have been in processing this unexpected turn of events. The most surprising aspect of receiving this news was how little impact it had on my daily emotional state, confirming that the healing process I'd been undergoing in Charleston had been far more thorough than I'd realized during those difficult first months of rebuilding my life from scratch. I'd been genuinely building something new rather than simply running away from something painful, and Brooke's current struggles felt like distant news about someone I'd once known rather than the dramatic downfall of someone who'd shaped my identity for an entire decade. This emotional detachment became even more pronounced when David mentioned that Brooke had specifically asked him to find out whether I'd been dating anyone in Charleston, a question that revealed her growing awareness that her backup plan of potentially returning to our stable relationship might not be available if I'd moved on with someone who actually appreciated the qualities she'd found so insufferably boring. I told David that my personal life wasn't something I planned to discuss with people who might relay information back to Denver, effectively cutting off that avenue of intelligence gathering while maintaining my privacy and emotional boundaries in ways I'd never learned to do during my relationship with Brooke. The contrast between my current sense of peace and purposeful direction versus the constant anxiety and self-doubt I'd experienced during those final months with Brooke couldn't have been starker, and I began to understand that what I'd mistaken for love had actually been a form of psychological dependence that had prevented me from developing into the person I was now becoming through independence and self-discovery. Brooke's efforts to reconnect escalated dramatically over the following months, evolving from casual inquiries through mutual friends to increasingly desperate approaches that revealed how completely her Seattle adventure had unraveled beyond anything I could have imagined. Her sister Linda began sending elaborate text messages about Brooke's regret and financial struggles, painting detailed pictures of her cramped studio apartment and part-time retail job, while her college roommate Jennifer started calling with emotional appeals about how Brooke had realized she'd made the biggest mistake of her life by abandoning someone who truly loved her for the illusion of excitement and success. The coordinated nature of these interventions was obvious to anyone who understood manipulation tactics, but I found myself feeling more annoyed by the inconvenience of blocking new numbers and email addresses than emotionally affected by the content of their increasingly frantic messages about Brooke's deteriorating situation in Seattle. During this same period, I met Isabella Rodriguez at a volunteer literacy program where I'd started teaching basic financial planning to adults working to complete their high school equivalency degrees, discovering that helping people understand budgeting and investment basics provided a sense of purpose I'd never experienced in my corporate consulting work. Isabella was a historic preservation architect working on Charleston's downtown restoration projects, and our initial conversations about the mathematical precision required for both financial modeling and structural engineering revealed an intellectual compatibility that felt refreshing after years of having to simplify or defend my professional interests to someone who viewed them as evidence of terminal boringness. Our relationship developed organically around shared interests in history, community service, and quiet appreciation for Charleston's architectural heritage, with weekend walks through historic districts where Isabella would explain the engineering challenges of preserving centuries-old buildings while I shared observations about the economic factors that had shaped the city's development. What struck me most about Isabella was how she listened to my thoughts and opinions with genuine interest rather than barely concealed impatience, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she valued my perspective instead of waiting for her turn to redirect conversations toward more exciting topics. The contrast between Isabella's authentic engagement with my actual personality and Brooke's constant pressure for me to become someone more worthy of her evolving ambitions couldn't have been more stark, and I began to understand what it felt like to be appreciated for exactly who I was rather than tolerated while someone waited for me to transform into their ideal partner. When Brooke somehow discovered my relationship with Isabella through social media investigation, her communications shifted from nostalgic appeals about our shared history to bitter accusations that I'd given up on us too easily and moved on without fighting for what we'd built together. The emails alternated between self-pitying apologies where she claimed to have learned important lessons about the value of genuine partnership over career ambition, and resentful attacks where she accused me of being emotionally unavailable and refusing to work through relationship challenges like a mature adult. I changed my email address and phone number again while deepening my connection with Isabella, who brought intellectual curiosity and genuine warmth to our partnership in ways that made me realize how much emotional energy I'd been expending during my years with Brooke just to maintain basic harmony and avoid triggering her criticism. Isabella never made me feel like I needed to apologize for my interests, defend my career choices, or modify my personality to deserve her affection, creating space for me to rediscover aspects of myself that had been gradually eroded during my relationship with someone who viewed my authentic self as a rough draft that needed constant revision and improvement to be worthy of her time and attention. The most remarkable difference was how Isabella responded to my financial planning hobby with genuine enthusiasm, asking me to help her organize her own investment portfolio and requesting detailed explanations of market trends that she found intellectually fascinating rather than mind-numbingly boring like Brooke had always claimed. When I showed Isabella the Astronomy Club's upcoming stargazing schedule, She immediately asked if she could join me for the next session, expressing authentic curiosity about celestial mechanics and bringing her architect's eye for structural precision to our discussions about planetary orbits. Her appreciation for my methodical approach to learning made me realize how much of my personality I'd been suppressing to avoid triggering Brooke's impatience with what she'd characterized as my obsessive attention to detail. Isabella's professional background in historic preservation meant she understood the value of careful research and long-term thinking in ways that aligned perfectly with my own approach, creating a foundation for intellectual partnership that I'd never experienced during my decade with someone who valued innovation over stability. 4 years after Brooke's departure, I returned to Denver for my college friend Miguel's wedding, proudly introducing Isabella as my fiancée and sharing news of our recent engagement with old friends and family members who'd witnessed the devastating aftermath of my relationship's collapse and were genuinely thrilled to see me so obviously happy and settled. The engagement had happened naturally during a quiet evening on our Charleston apartment balcony, where Isabella had been sketching architectural details from the historic buildings visible from our view while I worked on financial projections, both of us content in our parallel activities until I looked up and realized that this peaceful domesticity represented everything I'd actually wanted from a partnership. Isabella's response to my proposal had been characteristically thoughtful and genuine, asking if I was certain I wanted to spend my life with someone whose idea of excitement was debating structural integrity of 19th-century masonry techniques, which made me laugh and reassured me that I'd found someone who understood both my values and my sense of humor without needing either to be dramatically transformed. The Denver wedding reception was held at a historic hotel overlooking the Rocky Mountains, and I found myself genuinely enjoying conversations with people I hadn't seen since Brooke had systematically distanced me from friendships she'd deemed insufficiently sophisticated for her networking goals. During a quiet moment, I stepped onto the hotel's rooftop terrace to appreciate the mountain view and process how different my life had become since those dark months of questioning everything I'd believed about love and compatibility. That's when Brooke appeared, having somehow learned about Miguel's wedding through mutual connections and apparently decided that this represented an opportunity to confront me about our unresolved relationship issues in a setting where I couldn't simply block her number or ignore her attempts at communication. She looked older and more worn than I remembered, dressed in an outfit that seemed calculated to remind me of better times, and her approach carried the nervous energy of someone who'd been planning this conversation for months while unsure of how it would actually unfold. Her opening words were carefully rehearsed, beginning with congratulations on my engagement before quickly shifting to emotional appeals about how losing me had taught her the importance of genuine partnership over career ambition, and how she'd spent the past 4 years realizing that our 10-year history represented too much shared investment to abandon permanently. She spoke about her struggles in Seattle with calculated vulnerability designed to evoke sympathy rather than genuine emotional processing, detailing her financial difficulties while positioning them as learning experiences that had helped her understand what truly mattered in relationships. When I remained politely but firmly unresponsive to her emotional manipulation, she shifted tactics and began questioning whether I'd really given our relationship the effort it deserved, suggesting that my quick acceptance of our breakup had demonstrated a lack of commitment to working through difficult periods. I calmly explained that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and that Isabella represented the kind of equal partnership built on mutual support rather than the competitive dynamic that had characterized our previous relationship, where every conversation seemed to become a negotiation about whose needs and ambitions took priority. Her face went through several expressions as she processed my response, cycling from hope through confusion to something approaching panic as she realized that I wasn't just moved on but had actually found something better than what we'd shared during our decade together. She made one final desperate appeal, asking me to consider that 4 years of separation might have changed us both enough to make a renewed relationship possible, and suggesting that our shared history represented a foundation that couldn't be replicated with someone I'd only known for a short time like Isabella. I looked at her standing there on the terrace, backlit by the setting sun over the mountains, and felt nothing but distant sympathy for someone who'd become a stranger despite our shared past, realizing that the person I'd loved for 10 years had probably never existed outside of my own hopeful projections. The conversation reached its natural conclusion when I explained that I appreciated her willingness to apologize and acknowledge her mistakes, but that I'd built a new life with someone who valued the same things I did, and that returning to our old patterns would be unfair to everyone involved, especially Isabella, who deserved a partner whose emotional energy wasn't divided between past and present relationships. As I turned to go back inside, Brooke called after me with one last question about whether we could maintain some kind of friendship, which I answered honestly by saying that some chapters close completely and that sometimes the kindest thing is letting someone move forward without the complication of your continued presence. I rejoined the wedding celebration feeling lighter than I had in years, finding Isabella laughing with Miguel's grandmother about architectural stories that would have bored Brooke to tears, and I realized that witnessing Brooke's desperation had strengthened my appreciation for what I'd found with someone who enhanced my life rather than constantly pushing me to become someone different. Reflecting on that encounter months later while Isabella and I planned our own wedding in Charleston's historic district, I understood that genuine healing hadn't occurred through any dramatic confrontation with Brooke, but through the gradual process of building a life that reflected my authentic values rather than compromising myself to maintain someone else's approval and affection. The years in Charleston had taught me that happiness wasn't something I needed to earn through constant self-improvement or by becoming more exciting and ambitious, but something that naturally emerged when I stopped apologizing for who I was and found someone who appreciated my actual character rather than viewing it as raw material for their personal renovation project. I recognized that Brooke's comment about losing a decade revealed her fundamental view of relationships as investments with expected returns rather than shared journeys of mutual growth, and that her current desperation stemmed from realizing she'd abandoned stability and genuine partnership for the illusion of excitement that had ultimately proven shallow and temporary. The most profound realization was understanding how much emotional energy I'd been wasting during our final years together, constantly monitoring my behavior through the filter of her approval while suppressing aspects of my personality that she found insufficiently dynamic or professionally advantageous. Isabella and I had chosen to hold our wedding ceremony in one of Charleston's historic garden venues, surrounded by centuries-old oak trees, where the natural beauty required no artificial excitement to create meaning and joy for our guests who genuinely celebrated our partnership. The contrast between our wedding planning and what I imagined planning with Brooke would have been like couldn't have been starker, as Isabella approached each decision with thoughtful consideration for what would make our families comfortable rather than what would photograph well for social media. When we discussed our future together, Isabella never questioned my career trajectory or suggested I needed to become more entrepreneurial to deserve her continued affection, instead expressing genuine admiration for my methodical approach to financial planning and my commitment to building security through steady progress rather than spectacular gambles. Our conversations about money, career goals, and lifestyle preferences revealed a fundamental compatibility that I'd never experienced with someone who constantly pushed for more excitement and ambition. The wedding day itself felt like a celebration of authenticity rather than performance, with guests who knew and appreciated both Isabella and me for exactly who we were rather than who we might become with sufficient motivation and external pressure. During our first dance as husband and wife, I thought about Brooke's final question about friendship and realized that my answer had been completely honest. Some relationships serve their purpose and then end completely, not because of anger or resentment, but because continuing contact would prevent both people from fully embracing the lives they'd chosen to build separately. The most valuable lesson I'd learned was distinguishing between partners who enhance your life versus those who view you as an obstacle to their ambitions, and recognizing that true compatibility means finding someone who sees your stability as strength rather than limitation, your thoughtfulness as wisdom rather than overthinking, and your commitment to building something lasting as romantic rather than boring. Looking back on my decade with Brooke, I could finally see the pattern of emotional manipulation that had gradually eroded my self-confidence and made me believe that my natural personality traits were flaws that needed correction rather than qualities that the right person would treasure. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Brooke had spent years criticizing my supposed lack of ambition, I'd achieved more professional success and personal satisfaction in 4 years with Isabella than during the entire decade of constantly trying to prove myself worthy of someone who fundamentally didn't respect my approach to life. Our Charleston life represented everything I'd actually wanted from a partnership: intellectual compatibility, shared values, mutual support, and the kind of peaceful domesticity that allows both people to flourish while building something meaningful together. When former colleagues from Denver visited Charleston and met Isabella, they invariably commented on how much happier and more confident I seemed, noting that the anxious energy I'd carried during my final years with Brooke had been replaced by genuine contentment that came from being loved unconditionally. The financial security I'd built through steady planning had allowed Isabella and me to purchase a historic home near Charleston's downtown district, where we could walk to work and enjoy the simple pleasures that Brooke had always dismissed as evidence of my small-town mentality. Our weekend routines of farmers markets, sailing, and quiet dinners at home represented exactly the lifestyle I'd always found fulfilling, but now I could enjoy these activities without feeling like I needed to defend my preferences to someone who viewed them as obstacles. The final vindication came not from Brooke's obvious regret, but from my complete indifference to her situation and my genuine gratitude that she'd forced me to discover what authentic partnership actually felt like when both people brought their whole selves to the relationship without reservation.